Hello, my name is Sam Maxim. I'm Director of Product Management and Operations at Tamer, and I'm serving as track co-producer alongside Prashanth Sukal and Eddie Tornau for Virtual Track G, Global Issues in Data Analytics and Management. It is my pleasure to introduce the next session, How Data Products Enabled the Manufacturing and Distribution of COVID Vaccines. In this session, you'll hear how One Data was able to support fast and reliable vaccine production at scale using data products. Before I hand things over to the speaker, just a few housekeeping items. The session's being recorded. Any presentations will be included in the symposium proceedings, and video recordings will be uploaded to the CDOIQ YouTube channel 3 months after the symposium. There'll be a Q&A session at the end, and you can submit your questions in Whova's Apps Q&A tab. So with that, I'll turn things over to the session speaker, Dr. Sebastian Wernicke, Chief Data Scientist at One Data. Sebastian, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sam, for the kind introduction. And yeah, as mentioned, it'll be my pleasure to tell you a bit about a background story of the manufacture and distribution of the COVID vaccine. So yeah, maybe as a quick introduction, I always like to show a piece of code at the start of the presentation here. So let's just get this going. Yeah. So what you see here might look like a bit of gibberish, but it's actually a very important sequence here. So what you're seeing here on the screen is the sequence of the mRNA vaccine, or one of the popular mRNA vaccines called Comirnaty, which is probably more popularly known as the BioNTech Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine. And having a background in computer science, I think it's a fascinating piece of technology, actually, because it's not just a biological sequence, but you can actually interpret it as a piece of code. Of course, not just your standard computer code, but a biological code, which has nevertheless many similarities to how you would write a computer program. So it has some beginning instructions that tells you what the whole thing is about. You know, what to do, what the cell is supposed to do with this piece of mRNA, how much it's supposed to manufacture. Once the cell in the body has manufactured it, what's it supposed to do with it? So bring it to the surface. There's certain really smart molecule substitutions here to bring it past the immune system. So I would say that's analogous to skipping the malware detection algorithms, and it's really quite fascinating. It even contains a small piece of code that many programmers will recognize. You know, it's basically a copy and paste of a sequence that you can see here at the bottom, where nobody knows exactly what it's doing, but it's really highly useful. So it's a bit like using Stack Overflow, or maybe even something that ChatGPT generated. Now, this sequence, as I mentioned, you know, this is the vaccine. So many people listening here will actually have had this injected into their bodies at some point in time a couple of years ago, and that's probably also, you know, it's one of the reasons why we can have in-person conferences and are not just restricted to virtual events, or just the virtual streams, which of course is really nice. So many of you have heard the story. The vaccine, really awesome piece of technology. mRNA, I think, is going to bring lots of good things in the future as well. One of the fascinating things here is, of course, how fast this vaccine was developed. So you all might remember when the pandemic started out, you know, everybody was saying, well, we can be lucky, you know, if in 2 or 3 years we have some kind of vaccine. And actually the whole thing was just so much more faster than anybody had anticipated. So the genetic sequence was of the virus was made public early in 2020. Already 6 months later, you had FDA fast track designation for that vaccine, and then the pivotal phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials started. And at the end of the year, so within less than 12 months, you had emergency authorization for that vaccine. So, but that's, of course, you know, only one part of the story, because all the regulatory, you know, the invention, I mean, it's an amazing feat, but you have the invention of the vaccine, you have all the regulatory approvals. But then, of course, you need to get everybody vaccinated in order for this whole thing to work. And now you only need a very small amount of this mRNA molecule that I just showed you in order to vaccinate someone. So it's only 30 micrograms of mRNA you need in a single vaccine dose. But you need to manufacture a lot of that. So in fact, what BioNTech and Pfizer, together with their partners, accomplished was to produce 3.1 billion vaccine doses in the first year. And making a billion of anything is just a lot. So those 30 micrograms suddenly become 93 kilograms. That's about 200 pounds if you're not a fan of the metric system. And that's just the core component of that vaccine. Actually, you need a lot more things to produce all of these 3.1 billion doses. So in total, it's about 80 different ingredients that you need to make a vaccine. So ingredients doesn't just mean all the stuff that's inside of the vaccine itself, but it also it includes those little glass vials that the vaccine needs to be filled into. It contains things that seem trivial at first, like a special kind of glove. But since we are in a scenario where we are producing a medical product, it means actually that every single component, not only what goes inside the vaccine, but basically anything that touches the vaccine or some precursor of it, needs to be certified. So it needs to be a certain kind of blue glove. It needs to be a certain kind of glass vial. You try to change anything, you need to get it recertified. And that, of course, as I mentioned, 3.1 billion is a lot, and you have 80 different ingredients, and all of these need to be in place at the right time in order to produce all of those vaccine doses. Now, to add to the complexity of that, there's no single factory that can do those 3.1 billion doses. So how that vaccine was in fact produced was across 15 contract manufacturing organizations from 10 countries, which you see here at the bottom. So imagine that challenge. You have to set up a supply chain that allows you to reliably produce billions of vaccine doses that require 80 different ingredients, and you need to coordinate that across 15 manufacturing organizations in 10 countries. That's really not an easy feat. And of course, I'm just going to talk about the role that data products played in that. This is not to say that a majority of that task really goes to the people at BioNTech, who I think are just operational geniuses for pulling that whole thing off. And data, of course, played a part, but that's not to take away from the effort and success of all the people that really worked very long shifts and stayed up to make sure that the world gets vaccinated, just to mention that. So how does data play a role here? Well, in a complex supply chain like that, you need to manage it. And so that's why in the end, we at One Data were asked whether we could support the monitoring of that supply chain. We're a company that specializes on building data products. I'm going to talk a minute about what that means and also what role data products, of course, played here. So we were asked whether we could help with setting this whole thing up. And what we built was a project that we called Speedboat. And the idea of Speedboat is to build a data-driven tool that supports the vaccine production supply chain. First of all, by getting transparency about all of the raw materials, their stock, the stock levels, and the intermediate products that are needed. Then by automatically and continuously monitoring for any bottlenecks in the production. So whenever not just you see something running out, but basically you already predict that something might run out in the future, you're already starting to act to keep that supply chain running and manufacture those 3.1 billion doses of vaccine. The tool also needs to automatically identify room for action. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute a bit more. What we mean by that is in a high stress scenario like that, it's not just enough if you detect that something might run out you actually also need to use algorithms and data products to find out what to do about it and give recommendations and automate as much as possible. People in such a manufacturing scenario are stressed enough, so you need to support them as much as you possibly can. That also includes the automatic elimination of any risk positions. And then if you think this whole scenario a bit further, you don't just want to monitor actually the stock levels of your suppliers, but you also want to monitor the suppliers of your suppliers to even, have a much longer horizon of how far you can look ahead. So I'm going to show these to you in a bit more detail now, what that looks like. So first of all, this is what the transparency about the raw materials looks like. So essentially what you're doing is you look at the stock levels of the various supplies, and then you just run simulations under various parameters. So you know the existing stock, you know when it expires, you know how many orders you've already placed, you know the delivery times, even though the delivery times, that's something that's a bit difficult to model in this kind of scenario, because of course COVID was not just responsible for the need to produce as many vaccines. It also caused its own supply chain issues, which we're still facing today. So the prediction of delivery times became something that's quite difficult to do, and you need to put in a lot of contingency and actually to get that right. And then what you do with that data, it's pretty standard. You basically just do a heat map to focus the attention. You basically say, okay, red is where you need to do something immediately, orange is where something might happen, and green is no need for action. And that's a screenshot here, which shows anonymized data, of course. But it's basically what it looked like in the beginning. Everything was red. And so that is, of course, just knowing that there's problems everywhere is not really helpful. So you need to focus this down a bit more. So you need to basically automate for the crucial bottlenecks, because some things that might run out are much more critical than other things that might run out. Just if you look at the sort of production graph or DAG, how these things are manufactured. So the first thing you want to do is you focus it on the bottlenecks of the production. The second thing you want to do is you want to directly identify what can be done to resolve these red fields. So there's basically three things you can do if you have one of these red fields. So one is you may have a substitute product that you can actually use that you have already certified. So the easiest case, so if you think about these blue gloves, maybe you're running out of your stockpile of the 100 glove boxes, but maybe you have a 500 glove box sitting around somewhere, which is going to look different in the data. And that's why data products are very important. I'm going to come to that in a minute. But you can find some substitute. And as long as you identify that in the data, you can actually use it. The second thing you can do, as I mentioned, we had over 15 production sites. So what you can, of course, also do is look at the different production sites. And if you notice that a critical product is running out at one site, but there's still an excess at another site, or at least they have enough to keep going for a while, you just redirect it from one manufacturing site to the other site. And the third one is what I mentioned is that you can actually look also into not just the data of your suppliers, but the data of your suppliers' suppliers. And maybe you can find some substitute or excess stockpile there. That's basically the three things you can do. Now, the important thing is that you don't just want to identify the options. You actually need to more or less automatically generate recommendations. So again, like I mentioned, you can imagine a stressed out supply manager sitting in front of the screen where everything's flashing red. You really want to direct their attention to where human attention is needed. And the rest, you really just want to make recommendations of what can be done, have them look over it, but it's basically just an approval of options that were pre-generated. Otherwise, you have no chance of dealing with all of this complexity in the timeframes that are required. And then, of course, as I mentioned, you go over the not just into your direct suppliers, but you go into the entire supply chain network, build a visualization of this. This here is shown with a module called data cartography in our One Data platform, to really get a sense of, also visually where the critical points are and where in the flows you might have options for action and to resolve them. Now, why data products and why build a speedboat like that? Those are the two common questions I suppose you're having right now. Let's address the speedboat question first. So one of the common questions is, well, why build a custom tool to do this kind of monitoring and not just use a, let's say, standard supply chain solution? The reason for that is speed, essentially. Because at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when it was known that a lot of this vaccine had to be manufactured at a huge scale, it's not like you already have a perfect supply chain system set up for this. You don't even really know what your supply chain looks like in the beginning. You're all setting this up as you go along, and you need some flexibility to, also when you see where the actual issues arise, you need a lot of flexibility to basically make sure that the tool that you use for the monitoring and the action resolution is doing exactly what you want it to. And they're building a solution out of the box with some pre-configured components, of course, that we brought to the table, is just the better and faster way, rather than trying to set up something that's just too big and too inflexible. The second aspect that was crucial for the success of a tool like this is to really think in data products, and this is a kind of different way of thinking about data products than we have heard in the previous talks today. So in the keynote this morning, for example, it was, when we, and this is, I think, the classical way of thinking about data products, which also, of course, we think about and build. It's a lot about thinking in these long-term data domains and these long-term needs that you have, like building a customer 360 view. Of course, that's very important. And it's also something that I would recommend to, or we at One Data would recommend to any business that they do, and really think in data products and domain-driven design here. But here, it's more like a fast-moving consumer goods product of data that you need. Because in order, again, to imagine that complexity here, you have these 15 different manufacturers. You have all of these different products. Physical products that are needed for the manufacturing of the vaccine. So you will need a lot of data integration to make this work. And all of these supplies, they will be named slightly differently. They will be in slightly different formats. Sometimes they change. Sometimes a new supplier needs to be added. So you also need, in this scenario, to think about data products and not just data models. So if you just specify a data model and say, okay, this is the way that we want the data to run into this tool, you get the, let's say, you get the specified formats, but you don't get all of the other things that you need. In particular, you don't get the quality control, you don't get the quality monitoring, the continuous one, you don't get the anomaly detection that you have. So the way that I like to think about it is, if you just have a data model, it's like a standard electrical plug. You plug it in, and it works, but you don't really know what you're getting. Whereas if you think about something like a USB plug or lightning connector, like you see here, it's actually a much smarter interface, because the interface itself, knows what you're getting and what you want, and is able to intermediate between this. And this is also where I think that data products played a very crucial role here in making sure that these interfaces don't just have the right formats, but they actually have the right content that we need for the tool. A third component that was really crucial to make this work is the use of AI, and I found it very interesting. If you listen to the keynote this morning, we also use AI extensively to connect data, to find data that can be matched and mapped across different sources, to quality monitor it. So it's a very interesting use case of AI where you're not, it's first the data, and then you put that data into some machine learning and AI algorithms, but it's actually kind of reversing that value chain where you use machine learning and AI to clean the data, to monitor the data, to quality assure the data, before it even goes into the use cases. Now, just to mention how the story continued, I mean, of course, 3.1 billion vaccines produced. That was already great, but the supply chain doesn't end there. You also need to get these vaccines distributed. Now, this is a bit specific to Germany. Other countries, though, did it similarly, or there are some that did it similarly. So in Germany, a lot of the vaccination was actually happening through so-called vaccination centers, so big locations that were just set up to get as many people vaccinated as possible in the shortest amount of time. And that presented its own supply chain challenge. First of all, because as you might remember, you need 2 doses of the vaccine. So if you have an appointment for your first dose, you also need to make sure that the second dose is there in the given time frame. So the 3 to 6 week time frame that you need for your second vaccination. You don't just have vaccines from BioNTech and Pfizer. Of course, you have also the other vaccines like from Moderna, AstraZeneca, J&J, that were available. And you always have to strike this balance between, on the one hand, you need to make sure that the second dose is there when you need it. On the other hand, you don't want to have excess stock. So that really was its own balancing act. And again, here, we developed a supply chain tool called OneVac, which basically, just like the other tool, ran simulations all of the time and presented scenarios. So it basically looked at, how many doses does each of the manufacturers expect to deliver to the state. So we got that data from the state, and then ran simulations on appointments and what those appointments might mean for the future need of vaccines, and then basically through Monte Carlo simulations calculated windows of error in order to present the decision makers with the right options that they could do and how many vaccines to route to each vaccination center as that was needed. And those simulations also proved to be quite crucial to make sure that all of this produced vaccine is actually used and there's no excess stock, and at the same time everybody that had their first appointment also gets their second shot really in time here. Again, automation is very crucial here. So we integrated directly the ordering process for additional vaccines into a tool like this, just to make it as seamless as possible. So it's not just about producing accurate views into the future. It's actually also making sure that people can really act on them clearly and fast as possible. Again, here, data products played a crucial role because you have so many different data sources. You have the vaccination history from government data. You have hospital and vaccination center data. You have vaccine manufacturing plans updated by the manufacturers, and other things like Excel files for the capacities of the vaccination centers. So again, here you need to make sure that you productize this data, that you don't just expect it into a certain model, but that you actually build data products around it that make sure that after a certain point in the analysis workflow, you really have the data in the quality assured format and content that you need and expect in order to drive the right and accurate decisions here. To summarize this whole thing, what were the main insights from this journey, which was really a very exciting year to assist there with the manufacture and distribution of the COVID vaccine? So first is, if we had given this talk about 4 or 5 years ago, we would have talked a lot more about algorithms, and algorithms, I think, are just out of the box right now. So the speed and development and making sure that everything works as intended comes from product thinking, combined with some scalable technology and the ability to rapidly iterate solutions. AI, as I mentioned, plays a completely new role in this whole thing. It helps you find the data and quality assure data. So it's not it's not just as at the end, it's actually a means to an end to get the data where it needs to be. Third thing, I mentioned this a couple of times, automation. If something's not automated in a highly critical scenario like this, it won't happen. And so using data product thinking for everything, also building modular architectures, quality assurance, documentation, CI/CD, means that data product thinking for me is not about the data product itself, but it's also about treating the workflows, the ingestion, and the algorithms like you would any other critical piece of software, and really make sure that you have best practices running around that. And in the end, always good to mention, it's of course not an entirely new learning, but we also saw it time and again here. User experience is more important than the last point in accuracy. You really need to make sure that the supply chain managers, the decision makers, don't just get the right information, but they get it in a way that they know how to act on it and that they can quickly act on it. Now, as we all know, the vaccine that certainly helped, that we can travel again and meet again, but the supply chain issues are not over. We see, problems with production stops, supply chains breaking down, and all of these nasty effects. So I really believe that data product thinking wasn't just a crucial part to get the vaccine going, but that it's also going to play a really crucial part in addressing and solving all of the major supply chain issues we're seeing these days. And yeah, let's hope that we can de-stress some supply chains with data products. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention and look forward to your questions. If you're here at the conference, please meet me, say hi. Otherwise, you can reach out at sebastian.wernicke@onedata.de, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
So if you have any questions, you can submit them in the Whova Q&A tab, and I'll read any that come through. But to start, you mentioned that you used AI to connect and prioritize the data sources. Could you talk a bit more about that and how you made those decisions?
Mm-hmm. Of course. So the crucial problem, of course, is that you have many data sources from all of these suppliers available where everything that you need might be formatted in a different way. It might be in a different table structure. It might be in a different location. So what you would normally do is, of course, you would go through it by hand and just try to somehow figure out, this data point at supplier A is probably the same one at supplier B, at supplier C. And that's way too slow and too error prone in a scenario like this. So you basically need algorithms to go through the data structures and make good proposals on how the data might be integrated and connected. And then you just check it in the end. But you cannot afford to have all of the manual effort to put up all of these things together. So you're trying to automate finding lineage and mappings between data here.
Okay. I haven't seen any questions come in through the chat. We are just a minute or so away from the end of this, so give one last call for questions. And if not, again, there's the Dr. Sebastian Wernicke's contact information down here. It sounds like he'd love to chat more on this. There'll be a 30-minute break, and we'll be back at 2 p.m. for my session with Dr. Sydney Heimbrock and Rebecca Friedman on gender diversity and data organization. So I hope to see some of you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks, Sam, for organizing.